Hungary has no coastline, but its strongest opening images look like a country quietly organised by water. Steam rises in cold air, not from a coast but from warm ground beneath a landlocked capital. Then the Danube appears, cutting through Budapest as if the city were built around a question. A lake widens toward the horizon, broad enough to make a country without a sea feel shorebound. And beyond the water, the Great Plain stretches outward where absence becomes part of the pattern. How can a landlocked country feel so shaped by water in its streets, its rhythms, and even the wide riverfront horizons before the map has explained why? The answer is not simply that Hungary has rivers, lakes, thermal baths, and broad lowlands stretching across the Carpathian Basin on the map. The stranger insight is that different kinds of water reveal different kinds of Hungarian life. Some water is visible, a river reflecting stone facades, bridge lines, and a capital divided by its own mirror. Some is hidden below streets and bath buildings, rising as steam into one of the country's most recognisable rituals. Some is emotional, held in summer memory along Balaton's reeds, piers, vineyards, and distant shore towns. And some is powerful because it is scarce, leaving roads and settlements stretched beneath a low open sky. This is why the opening cannot behave like a normal Hungary travel documentary. If we begin with landmarks alone, the country breaks into separate images: Budapest, Hungary, thermal baths, Lake Balaton, the plains. But together, those images form a single system of river, warm ground, inland shore, flatness and memory. The point is not to claim that water explains everything about Hungary. It is to avoid the opposite mistake, treating geography as background while culture appears to float without a physical cause. It is to notice how often the country becomes clearer when water, or its absence, enters the frame. Budapest gives the first clue because the Danube is not only scenery passing between monuments. It is a line of orientation, a route of movement, and a daily reminder that terrain can split a city. The same country that appears inland on a political map keeps producing edges, corridors, gathering places, and reflective surfaces. Balaton gives a different clue. Not ocean, not coastline, yet still a place where edge and horizon shape behaviour. Thermal water gives another. The landscape is not only what lies under sunlight, but what rises from below. The Great Plain complicates the idea further because flatness can organise life as strongly as visible water. Even the quietest frames are doing work here. Steam suggests heat, reeds suggest shore, and horizons suggest scale. So the contradiction is even wider, a landlocked country still defined by the river that cuts across its map and history. It is a country whose familiar beauty is often the surface expression of deeper physical systems. Now the map can finally appear on screen, tracing the route across the region, because the question has already been earned. Trace the Danube through Budapest, then follow the corridor toward the river bend that will later concentrate power. Look west to Balaton, the inland water that carries the emotional weight of a shore without becoming a sea. Look beneath the surface, toward warm water regions where geology enters architecture, leisure and public space. Then look east and south where the Great Hungarian Plain changes the rhythm from reflection to distance. The map no longer introduces a single destination. Instead, it reveals a pattern with routes, districts and landmarks showing how the place is organised and how its different parts connect. This chapter is the doorway into that pattern, not a list of places to visit. This is why the Danube, Balaton thermal basins and plains must be seen in sequence, rather than separated into attractions. Each landscape will answer one part of the same question, and each answer will change the one before it. Water gathers people in some places, disappears in others, and leaves culture adapting around both presence and absence. By the time we reach smaller towns and remade waterscapes, the opening paradox will no longer feel decorative. That is the promise of this Hungary documentary, to read the country through what the map first hides. The first place to test that idea is the capital, where the water-shaped thesis becomes visible immediately. One river places two very different landscapes side by side each day, with a greener bank on one side and a drier, more barren bank just across the same narrow stretch of water. If the Danube is more than scenery, what exactly does it divide and connect in Budapest? Budapest looks like one grand capital until the river makes its two personalities obvious. From above, the Danube is not just a decorative line, it is the first pressure shaping the city. On one bank, Buda rises into hills and ridges. On the other, Pest spreads flatter and wider. That contrast is not only symbolic, it changes how Budapest reads from the sky, the water and the street. The capital becomes Hungary's first proof that water can divide a place and make it more connected at once. A terrain view makes the split quiet but clear, slope on one side, flatter urban spread on the other. Buda feels vertical. Roads climb, walls step upward, and the castle ridge watches the river from above. Pest feels horizontal. Long avenues, public squares and flatter blocks pull the city outward from the riverbank. Between them, bridges do more than move traffic. They make daily life cross the geographic argument again and again. Each crossing turns the Danube from boundary into habit, work, school, errands, evenings, and views. This is why Budapest can feel unified and divided in the same glance. The river gives the city a centre, but not a single personality. From the Buda side, Pest appears as a broad illuminated plain arranged along the water's edge. From Pest, Buda Castle and the hills become a raised backdrop, almost a stone horizon. The famous landmarks matter here because they reveal scale, not because they need to be listed. The Hungarian Parliament building is most powerful when seen with its reflection, doubled by the river it faces. Buda Castle is most legible when the ridge beneath it is visible, lifting history above the water. Even the bridges become part of that composition, thin lines of connection across a strong physical divide. A typical Budapest documentary could spend hours on facades, dates and empires, lingering on the grand buildings lining the Danube, from the Parliament to Buda Castle. But for this story, the more important question is physical. Why did the city take this shape here? The answer begins with a river corridor, two opposing banks with settlements and roads divided by the water, and a constant need to cross back and forth by bridge or ferry. The bridges compress that story into a visible rhythm: separate, connect, separate, connect. A simple route along the bank shows the pattern: viewpoints on the hills, promenades on the flatter side. The Danube in Budapest is scenery, but it is also orientation and daily geography. People read the city by it: uphill or level, castle side or parliament side, crossing or staying. Even distant movement along the embankments feels shaped by the same river logic. That is the human layer of geography, not a slogan, just repeated movement through a divided landscape. The capital's beauty comes partly from friction between the banks, not from perfect symmetry. That friction also prevents Budapest from absorbing the whole film, because the capital is only the first proof. After this chapter, the story has to move beyond the postcard view and keep following the system into the streets, stations and service spaces that make it work. If Hungary seemed water-shaped in the opening, Budapest makes the idea visible in stone, bridges, slopes and reflections. But the chapter cannot stay on the surface, because one of Budapest's strongest clues rises as steam. Near the river city, another water system begins to appear, quieter and less mapped by the eye. Another kind of Budapest begins in courtyards, pools and warm vapour against winter stone. It does not divide hills from plains, it comes from below. So the capital is not only organised by the river we can see, it is also shaped by water rising from underneath, forcing its way up through cracks in the ground and steadily changing the landscape from below. What changes when the real map of the capital lies partly underground, hidden beneath streets and buildings that are still in use today? The most visible rituals in Hungary may be shaped by an invisible landscape below the surface. Steam is the clue that something else is working. What if the real map of Hungary is partly underground, beneath the capital, beneath the streets, beneath the postcard view? Thermal bathing is not just leisure scenery, it makes geology public, social and architectural in a way outsiders can actually see. After the Danube organised Budapest from above, another water system begins beneath the stone, the pools and the winter air. Budapest is known for Hungary thermal baths, including Széchenyi thermal bath, but their importance is larger than a postcard or spa guide. At Széchenyi, steam turns a hidden physical condition into something visible, shared, and almost ordinary inside the city. The camera keeps its distance because the ritual matters more than any single face, costume, or close-up moment. People arrive, pause, soak, speak quietly, and let the city slow around warm water for a while. In this sense, Budapest baths are not escapes from geography. They are one way geography enters daily life. A soft thermal layer map changes the question from where the Danube flows to what the ground releases below the city. The map should not pretend to know every spring, temperature or count without careful sourcing and local verification. Instead, it asks for a simpler reading. Warm water appears often enough to shape public space and national imagination. This is why Hungary geothermal imagery feels different from a normal city bath scene or a decorative hotel interior. A bath is infrastructure, architecture, habit and memory gathered around water the street itself cannot see. The ritual is public, but its source feels almost private. hidden below pavement, courtyards and the city's visible order. Seen from above, the pools become bright geometry inside a dense capital, framed by stone and winter haze. Seen from the waterline, they become something slower: steam, tile, stone, shoulders, silence, and time made visible. The point is not to count the baths, but to notice what they reveal about place and routine. Hungary is landlocked, yet one of its strongest water identities rises from movement we cannot easily trace underground. That movement gives Budapest baths their deeper meaning, and it also pushes the story beyond Budapest itself. Warm water gives the capital a social rhythm, but it also points west toward calmer landscapes and softer edges. The underground country is not confined to monumental buildings, famous courtyards, or the familiar image of the capital. It can appear as mist on open water, reeds at the edge, and reflections without a skyline. Westward, the same question becomes quieter. How does hidden heat change the way a landscape feels before anyone explains it? Lake Heves is widely associated with warm thermal water, so the image of mist becomes another clue in the larger system. Here the imagery changes from stone and symmetry to reeds, low light, and softened edges around the water. The Grand City bath becomes a wider Hungarian pattern, water appearing where the map alone would not predict it. That contrast is essential because Hungary's water story is not only about visible rivers, famous bridges, or lake horizons. A country shaped by water can also be shaped by warmth below the surface and habits built around it. It can appear in architecture, in health customs, in weekend routines, and in the quiet etiquette of shared pools. This is why the baths should not be treated as a wellness detour in a Hungary travel documentary. They turn geology into culture, and culture into something visible enough to film without explaining every technical detail. And because the system is partly hidden, it keeps changing how the country reads from above and from within. The next surface is wider, brighter, and more emotional. Lake Balaton, the inland horizon that behaves like a shore. From warm water below the surface, Hungary's water story moves westward to a lake wide enough to become a substitute shore. How does a landlocked country create a coastline without ever reaching the sea, building beaches and waterfronts hundreds of miles inland? This horizon looks coastal, but it belongs to a country with no sea. After steam and underground water, Hungary's water story opens outward, into a surface wide enough to change the country's emotional map. Lake Balaton matters not only because it is beautiful, but because it gives a landlocked country a shared edge to gather around. From a low shore, the far bank can disappear into haze and the line between lake and sky starts behaving like coastline. It is not the sea, but in Hungarian life it can play a sea-like role: departure, return, summer rhythm and memory. On the map, Balaton sits west of the capital, away from the Danube's monumental corridor and the bath's rising steam. That position matters. It turns the water story from public ritual into seasonal geography, something people move toward when the year opens. The lake becomes a direction, not just a destination. Roads, rail lines, towns and weekends bend toward its edge. Along the shore, the evidence is quiet. Reeds moving, small boats offshore, paths following water instead of streets. This is shore culture without an ocean behind it, shaped less by empire and more by repetition. Families arrive, leave and return, children learn the lake as a boundary, a playground and a measure of summer. The point is not that Balaton replaces a coast perfectly, it is that absence makes this shoreline more meaningful. In a country without saltwater horizons, a lake can become the place where open water feels shared. The word inland sea works best as a feeling, not as a measurement, a way to describe scale without pretending the lake is ocean. That careful distinction matters, because Balaton's importance is social before it is technical. The Tihany Peninsula gives that feeling texture: stone, lavender, abbey silhouette, and water visible from almost every slope. Here the lake is not only flat blue space, it gathers scent, old walls, vineyards, footpaths and lookout points. From above, Tihany looks like land reaching into memory, narrowing the lake and making the water feel almost held. This is why Balaton's culture is not simply recreational, it turns geography into a pattern of belonging. The same pattern appears in shore towns where the waterfront is practical, social and quietly ceremonial. Keshtili-style streets and lakeside facades show another version of the inland coast, town life arranged around light, promenades and arrival. In places like Keshtili, the architecture does not need to dominate the water, it frames the lake as a civic room. On a route map, Balaton links earlier chapters to what comes next. Budapest, Heves, the lake and the plain form one west-to-east rhythm. This is the western chapter of the same national pattern, where water becomes visible as orientation rather than monument. The Danube gave Hungary a capital split by water. The thermal ground made water rise. Balaton gives water a horizon. But the horizon is emotional as much as visual. It changes how a landlocked country imagines edges. The shore is where people can stand right at the edge of the land, on wet sand with waves at their feet without ever leaving the country at all. That small idea carries weight. A nation can feel coastal in habit, even when its outline never touches the sea. Look closely and the lake is less a backdrop than a calendar. Its meaning expands and contracts with the season. In quieter months, the same piers and reeds become reflective, almost private, showing that shared places do not vanish when crowds leave. In summer, the water reads differently, not spectacle but routine, with silhouettes on paths and boats small against the wide light. This rhythm gives Balaton documentary power. It shows how ordinary repetition can become national geography. And because it is ordinary, it avoids the postcard trap. The lake is not an escape from Hungary, it is one way Hungary gathers itself. A bench facing the lake, a station near the shore, a row of cottages behind trees, these are small forms of adaptation. The vineyards and hills around the water add another layer. The inland coast is not only shoreline but surrounding slope and settlement. A lake creates edges, but it also creates interiors, harbours, gardens, station platforms, shaded streets and rituals of arrival. This is the chapter's quiet reversal. Hungary's water identity is not only found in grand rivers or warm subterranean systems. It is found in the way a lake makes a country practice having a coast. That contrast prepares the midpoint of the film because the next landscape will remove the obvious water and test the thesis differently. Then the camera begins to turn away from water, reeds thin, reflections fade, and the horizon lowers. The emotional shoreline gives way to another kind of scale: open land, long roads, grass, sky and distance. But the lake's meaning changes when the camera turns away from water and enters the broadest open land in the country. What happens to Hungary's identity when the shore disappears and the horizon becomes flat land? The part of Hungary that looks emptiest may explain some of the country most clearly. From Balaton's edge, the camera turns away from water and the horizon suddenly becomes grass, road and sky. What if flatness is not absence but structure, a system that changes how a country is felt? The plain is not a pause between famous places. It changes settlement, travel, farming, visibility, and the feeling of openness. On the map, the Danube, Balaton, and the Great Hungarian Plain stop feeling separate. They begin to answer one another. By this point, Hungary may seem explained by visible water. Now the film asks what happens where water retreats. The Great Hungarian Plain stretches across much of the country's eastern interior, a broad, low landscape where scale becomes visible. Hortobágy and the Puszta Hungary image often stand for openness, but this is not a museum of rural life. It is easy to film the plain as emptiness, harder to see its organisation because its patterns are quieter. Long roads become more than roads. Here they are measuring lines across space with few vertical interruptions. At this scale, distance becomes a daily fact. The horizon tells you as much as a landmark ever could. The settlement edge matters: a few roofs, a line of trees, and open land pressing from every side at once. Distant grazing animals are not scenery for nostalgia. They are part of land use, movement, and managed open ground. The Hungary countryside here asks for a wide frame because a close postcard would miss the point. On open plains, visibility changes behaviour. Weather, movement, work and waiting are read across distance. Balaton and the Danube are not gone from this chapter. Their absence here makes them more meaningful. In a low country, water management can matter even where the immediate scene appears dry to an outsider. Ditches, canals, fields and roads suggest water shaped by decisions, not only by rivers, lakes or sudden spectacle. If you're following the route, check the pinned comment for maps and links, and tell us which landscape is changing your view of Hungary. Then the horizon takes over again, because in this chapter, space is not decoration, it is evidence of another system. The Great Hungarian Plain makes Hungary's water story less simple and much more interesting because it introduces absence. It says a country can be organised by water and also by the spaces between water where routes lengthen. If Balaton gives Hungary a shared edge, the plain gives it interior, room, exposure, long approaches and patience. At the edge of the village, the place can feel smaller than it is, because the open sky makes every roofline and wall answer to a larger scale. Houses, tree lines, grain storage and farm tracks cluster like punctuation marks in an open sentence of land. This is how flatness structures settlement, not through drama, but through spacing, repetition and the logic of distance. The chapter also resets the film emotionally after baths, riverbanks and lake light. Silence becomes active rather than empty. It gives us time to understand absence as a force, not a lack and openness as design. Where landmarks stay low, rhythm comes from road, wind, field, and the seasonal work gathered around them. That is why Hungary plains should not be treated as in-between footage, or as blank land between famous places. They explain how national space feels when architecture stops dominating the frame and the horizon becomes the scale. And they make the return to water feel sharper because the eye has adjusted to openness first. As the route leaves the open interior, the map begins to contract back toward a river corridor. First the horizon lifts, then water returns, pressed between slopes and watched from higher ground. After the plain stretches the country outward, the Danube bend shows the opposite: water and elevation concentrating power. Why do bends in a river attract walls, faith and authority? North of Budapest, the Danube stops being just a beautiful river and becomes strategy. Here, water and elevation work together, concentrating movement, defence, visibility and authority in a way the open plain never does. After the flat horizon, this curve feels almost sudden. Land rising, water tightening, distance turning into focus. Why do curves in a river attract power? Because they slow the eye and often they slow movement too. A bend makes the river readable from above. Boats, crossings, approaches, and the narrow places where routes begin to matter. On open land, power can spread outward. In a river corridor, it gathers at the places everyone must notice. North from Budapest, the Danube does not simply continue, it begins to fold through hills and settlements. The map makes the change clear. North of the capital, water stops feeling wide and begins feeling channeled. The Danube bend is not only scenery, it is a lesson in how a landscape can organise attention. Forested slopes lift the view above the water, and that height changes what the river means. From a ridge, the Danube is no longer a line on a map, it becomes a field of vision. You can understand why walls appear here without needing a long chronology. The terrain itself explains the impulse. At Visegrad, Hungary castles are not just stone against sky, they are architecture answering elevation. The walls belong to the ridge as much as to history, following the logic of lookout, approach and control. The exact histories are layered, but the geographic question is more direct. What place would you choose if watching the river mattered? This is the opposite of the plain we just crossed. There, openness stretched the country outward. Here, geography pulls it inward. The river curve compresses distance, and the hills make that compression visible from almost every angle. Beauty is part of the effect, but beauty is not the explanation. The explanation is position. In a landlocked country built around water, the Danube-Hungary story changes whenever the banks begin to rise. Near Esztergom, the scale shifts again. A large religious profile over the river turns geography into presence. The basilica-like silhouette does not need to be treated as a date or a checklist. It works first as a landmark of height. Faith, authority, and movement meet where the river can be seen, crossed, approached, and remembered. This is how a river corridor becomes more than transportation. It becomes a stage where institutions can make themselves visible. The pattern is simple but powerful. Water brings roots, high ground brings visibility, and together they create importance. That is why the Danube bend feels different from a straight riverbank or a flat shore. It concentrates the country. Even the quieter views carry this logic. A ferry line, a road below trees, a town pressed between slope and water. People do not live beside geography as decoration. They adapt to its turns, its constraints, and its invitations. The places along the bend are therefore not isolated landmarks. They are responses to the same physical pressure. In this corridor, daily movement and older power share the same physical stage. The river is practical before it is picturesque. Roads follow the valley because the valley has already chosen the easiest path. Settlements gather where that path becomes useful. The chapter is not about ranking fortresses or naming every historic layer. It is about seeing why they appeared where they did. Once that is visible, the Danube bend becomes less like a postcard and more like a diagram made of water and stone. The same country that felt endless on the plain now feels edited by terrain. Every ridge and curve removes some ambiguity. That contrast matters because Hungary is not explained by one landscape. It is explained by the movement between them. The water that gathered people in Budapest and Balaton gathers power here because the land gives it edges. That movement is the real continuity. Water, flatness, heat, shore, ridge and town, each changing how life gathers. And from those edges the story begins to loosen again, leaving grand views for streets, squares and smaller human scales. But Hungary's layered identity is not held only in grand bends and high walls, it also sits in smaller towns where different eras remain visible in ordinary streets. What does Hungary look like when the capital and river monuments stop speaking for the whole country? Budapest is powerful enough to distort the rest of Hungary, but the smaller towns make the country harder to simplify. What happens when Hungary stops being one skyline? Here, history is not announced as a grand theme, it appears as street texture, rebuilt grids, fortress memory, religious layers, rivertown intimacy and everyday adaptation. After the bend's high walls and river views, the scale drops. The evidence becomes a doorway, a courtyard, a quiet square. On the map, these towns do not form a list. They sit where river, plain, hill and borderland pressures meet. Near Budapest, Szentendre keeps the Danube close, but softens it into lanes, colours, church towers and human-scale river life. Its value here is not that it is picturesque, it shows how the river can create intimacy after chapters of national scale. The water is still a corridor, but now it carries artists, weekend walkers, small shops and layers of Serbian Orthodox presence. This is Hungary beyond Budapest, not a rejection of the capital, but a quieter proof that the same systems repeat differently. Move northeast and the mood hardens. In Eger, Hungary, stone rises again, but not with the same river-commanding scale. Fortress memory, Baroque streets, churches and Ottoman-era traces sit close together, turning history into a walkable compression of pressures. The point is not to reduce Eger to one siege, one empire or one postcard view. Its texture is accumulation. A town like this makes the past less abstract because eras touch each other at street level. In Pécs, Hungary, the layering changes again. Southern light, stone facades, sacred architecture and civic space create another grammar. Roman traces, medieval Christian forms, Ottoman-era memory and later urban life are often visible in close proximity, though details deserve care. That closeness matters because Hungary is not explained by one direction of influence or one historical wound. It is built from contact, interruption, rebuilding and ordinary continuity, with each town holding a different arrangement of the same forces. Then the plain returns through the city. Szeged sits in the southern lowlands where openness meets urban order. Szeged is widely associated with major flood damage and later reconstruction. The exact story needs sourcing, but the urban lesson is clear. A city can be shaped not only by monuments inherited from the past, but by the need to rebuild after water intervenes. Its broad squares, ordered facades, and civic rhythm suggest that catastrophe can leave a city with a deliberate public face. Here, water is not leisure or scenery, it is the force that can erase, rearrange, and discipline urban life. Across these towns, the human layer is often modest. Morning squares, bakery doors, tram lines, shaded benches, market edges. These are not background details. They show how history survives by becoming ordinary, used, repaired, crossed, and taken for granted. A church tower matters differently when it is beside a school, a cafe, a bus stop, or a riverbank path. The national story becomes easier to understand when it's allowed to shrink to the scale of errands and weather. Budapest shows a dramatic split. Hills and flat city facing each other across the Danube, the towns show smaller negotiations. Szentendre turns river contact into intimacy, Eger turns pressure into stone memory, Pécs turns layers into civic texture, Szeged turns rebuilding into form. None of them summarizes all of Hungary, and that is exactly why they matter. Each interrupts the temptation to simplify. They make the country less like a single skyline, and more like a set of local answers to geography and time. Seen together, Hungary beyond Budapest is not a detour from the thesis. It is where the thesis becomes human. The map starts to look less like an outline and more like local choices, with roads bending around terrain and borders shaped village by village. After river, heat, lake, plain, bend, and town, the pattern is no longer only natural, it is also made. People adapt to water, rebuild after it, settle beside it, preserve around it, and sometimes reshape the land itself. The next landscapes may look stranger, but they come from the same habit, turning geography into daily form. And once Hungary's identity is no longer reduced to its famous skyline, the strangest landscapes begin to make sense too. Are there places that look least like the postcard revealing the rule more clearly? Some of Hungary's most surprising places look like exceptions until the whole film has taught us how to read them. What if the strangest places reveal the rule? Bukid-style floating houses, quarry lakes, preserved villages and ridge castles show landscape as something Hungarians keep adapting. The first image is almost disorienting. Small wooden houses resting over still water, each reflection doubling the settlement and unsettling the expected map. This is the Bokod floating village, or a Bokod-style waterscape, and it does not behave like a familiar Hungarian postcard. It looks delicate, but the larger clue is practical. Water here has been occupied, crossed, organised, and turned into a lived edge. In this chapter, exact origins, current access and naming still need careful verification. The pattern does not depend on exaggerating the facts. The point is not that Hungary is full of secret places, it is that altered places make the countrywide system more visible. A walkway over water is a small piece of infrastructure, but visually it feels like a whole geography compressed into wood and reflection. After the Danube, Balaton and the Plain, this kind of water feels different. Smaller, stranger, more handmade and almost improvised. It also changes the scale of the national thesis. Water is not only monumental or emotional, sometimes it is practical and adapted. The same shift happens at Magyar-hegyi Tengersem, often associated with a dramatic quarry lake landscape in northern Hungary. Instead of a wide lake horizon, water appears enclosed by stone, held inside a cut and altered piece of ground. Where Balaton opened outward, the quarry lake pulls the eye inward toward geology, extraction, memory, and what remains after use. That contrast matters because Hungary's water story has never been only about rivers, baths, and leisure along recognisable edges. It is also about what people do when ground is cut, flooded, preserved, repaired, or repurposed over time. The calm pool below stone walls can feel less natural than Balaton, but not less connected to Hungary's deeper pattern. It belongs to the same conversation: water meeting work, terrain, memory and new uses after the original purpose changes. The image is surprising because it refuses the simple categories of nature, industry and heritage that travel images often depend on. From there, the chapter turns toward village texture, where remaking does not always mean dramatic alteration or artificial water. In Holocaust-style rooflines and lanes, preservation is visible as care, not as a frozen performance outside modern life. The caution matters. Villages are lived places, not museum props, and their meanings change with the people who maintain them. Still, the visual language is powerful. White walls, steep roofs, stone paths, and a settlement scaled closely to slope, weather and use. Here, culture appears as maintenance. The landscape is not conquered or staged, it is negotiated, repaired, limited, and kept legible. Then the train rises again, and a ridge castle brings the Danube bends lesson back in another, more concentrated form. A Baldocco-style castle does not need a long explanation to reveal the logic of its position. Stone follows height. Walls answer slope. Architecture becomes a way of reading the ground from above and controlling approach. After the open plain, this is the opposite sensation: compressed elevation, guarded approaches, and a horizon that can be watched from stone. Now the chapter's strange places start to make sense, echoing details we've already seen across the landscape, from isolated landmarks to the broader terrain around them. Bokod answers the water thesis in wood, reflection, and access. Magyar-hegyi Tengersem answers it in stone, enclosed water, and altered ground. Holoko answers it through preservation and maintenance, while Boldocco Castle answers through terrain-bound architecture. None of them replaces Budapest, Balaton, or the Great Plain. They make those larger places harder to misunderstand. This is not a guide to Hungary's hidden landscapes. It is the late proof that anomalies can clarify a country. On the map, these points sit apart, but visually they repeat one habit: adapting land until it becomes culture. The water may be artificial, altered, enclosed, or reflected, but it still behaves like a national clue. The ground may be preserved, quarried, fortified, or repaired, but it still shapes human choices. By now, the map that looked landlocked at the beginning has become a pattern of river, heat, shore, plain, bend, town, and altered water. So what does Hungary look like when all of these pieces are placed back onto a single map of Central Europe, with its borders redrawn in one view? The same map that looked landlocked at the beginning now reads as a system, not a sealed interior but a country crossed by clues. What changes when Hungary is read through water, ground, and flatness instead of landmarks alone? The answer is not one image, it is repeated adaptation to river, heat, shore, open land, elevation, rebuilding, and memory. Earlier, Budapest seemed like the obvious centre. Now it looks like the first diagram of the country. One bank rises into hills, the other spreads flatter. The Danube does not decorate the capital, it organises it. Then the film dropped below the city, where warm water made geology visible through steam, stone, and public ritual. That hidden layer mattered because it turned the underground into something social, something ordinary, something people could gather around. Balaton widened the same idea. A lake became a horizon, a seasonal edge, and a way to feel coastline without a sea. The Great Plain then removed the obvious water, and the absence made the earlier rivers and lake feel sharper. Out there, flatness was not emptiness. It was scale, movement, settlement, agriculture, and sky made into daily rhythm. The Danube bend answered with the opposite shape, water compressed by elevation, where river, ridge, defence, and faith met. And the towns gave the pattern a human scale: streets, squares, repaired facades, religious layers, markets, and ordinary crossings. In the altered waterscapes, the late surprise was not that Hungary had anomalies, it was that the anomalies still followed the rule. A Hungary documentary can become beautiful places. This journey has tried to do something more specific. It raises a basic question. Why does Hungary look so different when you read the map not by borders alone, but as a web of relationships stretching across Central Europe? River to capital, heat to ritual, lake to memory, plain to movement, bend to power, towns to layered belonging. None of those relationships is enough alone. Together they make the landlocked outline feel less like a limitation. They make it feel like a frame, holding several kinds of water and several kinds of ground at once. Look again at Budapest, and the familiar riverfront is no longer only architectural grandeur, it is terrain made public. Look again at the baths, and steam becomes more than atmosphere, it is an underground country briefly entering the air. Look again at Balaton, and the horizon is not escape from Hungary, it is one of Hungary's ways of gathering itself. Look again at the plain, and the open distance is not a blank between destinations, it is part of the destination's meaning. Look again at the bend, and the river is no longer a soft line, it becomes a corridor of decisions. Look again at regional towns, and history is not only preserved behind monuments, it is carried through ordinary public space. Look again at floating huts and quarry water, and altered landscapes no longer feel outside the story. They clarify it. This is the closing movement of Travelodic Hungary, not a guide, but a way of reading places together. The route now behaves less like travel and more like a layered map of causes and habits. Some causes are physical: river courses, warm ground, lake edges, flat horizons, and high viewpoints over moving water. Some are cultural: bathing, walking, crossing, repairing, returning to shores, keeping villages lived in, and rebuilding after rupture. Between those two, Hungary becomes legible in a calmer way, without forcing it into a simple historical slogan. It is neither only Budapest nor only countryside, neither only empire nor only leisure, neither only memory nor only change. It is a landscape system, and every beautiful surface has been pointing back to that system all along. Hungary begins this film as a contradiction, landlocked yet repeatedly defined by water. By now, that contradiction has softened. The Danube gives the capital its two terrains. Warm water turns geology into public ritual. Balaton offers an edge. The Great Plain proves that openness is not emptiness. The bend shows how water and elevation can concentrate meaning. Smaller towns carry history in ordinary streets, and altered waterscapes reveal how people keep remaking land around them. None of these places explains Hungary alone. Together they change the map from a border outline into a pattern of use. The country is not just monuments or a beautiful capital with scenery around it, it is a working geography. Water, flatness, memory and adaptation keep appearing in different forms, until the landlocked map no longer feels dry or closed. Instead, it feels like a place that found other ways to turn water into identity, shaping daily life in the streets, markets, and routines built around it. The final image returns to water, not as decoration but as the clue that was visible from the first scene. If a country can be misread by its most famous images, what other maps are we seeing too quickly?